Hello, everyone, and welcome to the HDRO IIEP OPHI Joint Series on Multidimensional Poverty, coming to you today from the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies on Mostyn Road in Oxford, UK, and online from the George Washington University here in Washington, DC. I'm James Foster, the Carr Professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, and Research Associate in Oxford's Department of International Development. I'll be introducing today's installment of this term's series, which, as usual, is jointly sponsored by the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, the Human Development Report Office, or HDRO, of the UNDP, and the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, here at the Elliott School. Today's presentation is on human development and poverty challenges in Arab countries by Dr. Khalid Abu-Ismail of ESCWA, with discussion by Dr. Adeel Malik of Oxford's Department of International Development and Corinne Mitchell of OPHI. In just a moment, I'll provide a brief introduction of today's speakers, but first I'd like to thank the three joint sponsors for the continued support of the series, which illustrates the power of measurement for addressing the needs of people. In our last episode 2 weeks ago, Kim Samuels and colleagues from OPHI discussed the concept of belonging in the digital world. Next week, I'll be presenting work on multidimensional inequality and formally bringing the terms series to a close. The following week, IIEP will be hosting a special side event that may also be of interest to you. On Monday, December 4th, Nobel laureate Dr. Muhammad Yunus joins us here in Washington, DC for a conversation on how to put poverty in a museum and to kick off the Yunus Initiative for extreme deprivation here at GW. Since this event will take place at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, it will also be recorded for more convenient viewing by folks in Europe and South Asia. And indeed, all our series is online at our YouTube channel, IIEP GW. Now, today's speaker, Dr. Khalid Abu-Ismail, is chief of the Economic Development and Poverty section in the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, and formerly macroeconomics and poverty policy advisor with UNDP's Regional Center for Arab States. He provides policy advice and policy-oriented research on topics related to human development, poverty, inequality, and economic growth. He received his doctorate in economics from the New School for Social Research in New York City. He is also an Economic Research Forum policy affiliate. Our first discussant and our local host in the center is Dr. Adeel Malik, Associate Professor in Oxford's Department of International Development, Globe Fellow in the Economics of Muslim Societies in the center, and Research Associate at two centers in the Department of Economics at Oxford, the Center for the Study of African Economies and the Center for the Analysis of Resource-Rich Countries. A development macroeconomist, his interdisciplinary work on the Arab Spring has garnered much attention, and he is currently exploring the interplay between land, politics, and religion in Pakistan. He completed his doctorate in economics at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar in 2004 and has held many prestigious research affiliations both here at Oxford and abroad. Our second discussant is Corinne Mitchell, Director of Programs and Operations at the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, where she has been since 2015. In this role, Corinne manages the day-to-day affairs at OPHI, but also works with national governments and international agencies in creating and analyzing multidimensional poverty measures. She recently led a research project computing changes in multidimensional poverty over time for 80 countries. She also helps coordinate the activities of the Multidimensional Poverty Peer Network, MPPN, which connects countries interested in MPIs. Welcome to all of you. with no further delay, let me turn it right over to Dr. Adeel Malik, who will take it from here. Dr. Malik?
Thank you, James, for this kind introduction. I'll be very quick. Just two things. One, a warm welcome to everyone, both our online participants as well as those who joined us today on a Monday late afternoon. The center is proud to host this as part of its research cluster on economics and economic and human development in Muslim societies. So this seminar really falls in the middle of it. The format of the seminar is very simple, about 40 minutes by Khalid, and then quick discussion from myself and Corinne. And then we'll open the floor for discussion. And for those who are joining us in person, there will be a reception around 5:30 where we can interact a lot more over tea, coffee, and refreshments. So over to you, Khalid, and perhaps we can mute from our end so that we can, there's no interruption from our end at least. So Khalid, welcome.
Thank you, Adeel. Thank you, Professor James. I'm delighted to be here with you today. Well, many thanks with the HDRO, IIEP, OPHI seminar for this invitation. My intervention will not be technical. This is basically going to be a storytelling exercise, and it's going to be based on a lot of the work that we have done with ESCWA over the past 4 to 5 years, and especially two reports, which you can see the cover pages on the screen. One is the second Arab multidimensional poverty report done with collaboration with OPHI and other UN agencies in the League of Arab States. And the other one is the World Development Challenges report, which we produced in 2021. So I have three interventions, so to speak, and one is more on the human development side, and that will take us through stories using the HDI and our own indices, and the other one is on poverty, and the second intervention would be mainly on both income poverty and multidimensional poverty. And then finally, there's the reflections on what can be done based on the numerous stylized facts that those two parts will cover. But before we start, there's an important clarification for, I guess, most of you familiar with the Arab region. The high level of diversity that is in the region poses usually a classification challenge. So, we have very rich countries, very poor countries, and large countries, small countries, oil rich, oil poor, and so forth. So this usually makes it difficult to tell the story. But many of our papers, I tend to prefer to have a classification that distinguishes between the GCC oil-rich countries, the middle-income, more diversified economies, and then the third category of countries, which is mainly the LDCs and conflict-affected countries. So let's start with the human development story for the region. Now, we're all familiar with the HDI, and it's usually a good starting point because the HDI obviously focuses on these critical human capabilities and achievements, and it's been used as a basis for telling the development story of the region over the past 2 decades or so. Well, in 2021, according to the latest data available, the Arab region as a whole, including all of these countries, the 22 countries included in the 3 groups that I mentioned, would have an average HDI of 0.708. That would bring it just slightly above the high human development threshold, very close to the world average. And this is the distribution of countries, Arab countries, according to the groups of the HDI's index score. And most of the countries are actually either very high level or high level of human development. with only 3 countries in the low human development category. So that's actually not a bad picture to start off with. And in fact, if you look at the trends, the Arab region has been progressing from the 1990s, even throughout the 2000s, and closing in on the gap with the world average. So, you know, the Arab region's HDI has been basically getting closer to the global average, and of course not the same rate of progress as East Asia, but you know, it looks like we have been having these impressive gains in these basic achievements in income, education, and health. Now, of course, you notice that for all groups after 2019, there's a bit of a flattening in the line, which of course is due to the COVID-19 impact. Now, if you go back to 1970, these gains become all the more impressive. And according to the 2010 Global Human Development Report, which uses the hybrid HDI, in fact, 8 of the countries that witnessed the fastest improvements in human development were from the Arab country. And Oman had the fastest rate of achievement. And that's quite impressive. And what's even more impressive is that these gains were not, as one would expect in an oil-rich region, attributed to the rise in income, but rather to achievements in life expectancy and in education. Now, of course, you'll see that the groups of countries are not the same in terms of their achievement rates. And you'll also see that after 2010, the low human development group has witnessed setbacks. And that's, of course, due to conflict, which will be a recurring theme in our presentation. But let me move now to the World Development Challenges Report, which is essentially ESCWA's attempt to take this HDI narrative a bit further by going back to the same idea of human development, but from a wider angle, because the HDI was intended to focus on the critical freedoms and capabilities. But of course, as the the HDR of 2010 itself highlighted, human development is more than just the 3 indicators in the HDI. It encompasses many issues like agency, the ability to participate in decision making. It encompasses, of course, sustainability and equity. And these are critical aspects that we try to capture in the Development Challenges Index. Development Challenges Index is essentially made out of 3 components. One, which is the traditional Human Development Index, but adjusted for quality. So you've got the quality adjusted income, health, and education. Then we bring in an Environmental Sustainability Index, which has 2 components. It has a climate change and energy efficiency component, which is basically the health of the planet and our own health, and how healthy life expectancy is affected by factors such as pollution, access to water, sanitation, etc. But the more important, I would say, intellectual contribution is in the area of bringing in governance to the heart of the way that we measure human development. And here we have a governance challenge component, which has 2 aspects to it. One is democratic governance, things like rule of law, participation, accountability. And the other one is government effectiveness, which is the ability of governments to undertake their tasks in an effective manner, provide good public services and infrastructure, for example. Then we're also introducing a Development Inequalities Index, which is essentially the sub-national inequalities, within country inequalities, in these 3 pillars that I just mentioned. but not the same indicators, I have to say. It's very difficult to get. And these are mix of horizontal and vertical inequalities between groups as well as between rich and poor. Now, because we're dealing with a challenge rather than an achievement, it's a flip of the HDI. So the closer you get to one, the higher the level of the challenge, and the closer you are to zero, the lower the level of the challenge. And the way you rank countries is that number one rank would be the most challenged country worldwide. And that was intentional because we wanted to have a shift of the focus and the message to what needs to be done to overcome these shortfalls from, to achieve development progress. The other innovation that we have is that we have 5 categories rather than 4. So because a lot of the countries moved to the high and very high challenge category, we also had to introduce a very high level of challenge. So with this brief introduction on the methodology and purpose of the index, let's go over the Arab region and see what are the stylized facts that emerge. Well, the first thing that comes out is the Arab region has a high level of challenge on the DCI, much higher, in fact, than the world average. And there hasn't been much progress, especially since 2010. We also find that I forgot to mention that there's, because we have an arithmetic average, not a geometric average, we're able to break down the DCI into its 3 components. You can see the share of each of these components in the makeup of the DCI. As it turns out, the governance is the highest share, has the highest share of the DCI in the Arab region, much higher than the world average and much higher than in other regions. Well, that also, interestingly, comes up to a very different story about the distribution of countries, because we don't have a single Arab country that has a challenge below the medium level. And more than 2/3 of the countries are the population, of the region lies in countries that are classified as a high level of challenge or a very high level of challenge. So this is remarkably different than the HDI narrative. When you bring in these quality of human development, sustainability, and governance aspects, the story changes dramatically. And in fact, 3 of the countries with the highest level of challenges worldwide are from the Arab region: Yemen, Sudan, and Syria. And to demonstrate how much the narrative changes, just look at the rank differences between the HDI and the DCI. Similar to the income and the DCI, a lot of the countries, most of the countries in the region lose ranks, and significantly so in the case of oil-rich countries. But interestingly, some countries gain ranks, 3 countries specifically: Morocco, Tunisia, and Jordan. Now, why this is the case would require, I guess, further discussion, which you can come back to in the Q&A. But let's also focus on this new stylized fact, which is the fact that for 2/3 of the population, and since 2000, there's been very little progress in human development from this broader perspective. And in fact, for countries that are in a very highly challenged category, there has been setbacks since 2010. When we look at the components within each of these challenges that are most pressing, quality education is the most pressing development challenge in the quality adjusted human development component. Environmental health is the most significant challenge in the sustainability pillar, things that affect healthy life expectancy. It has a significantly higher contribution to that sustainability index. And government effectiveness is, as we said, the most pressing challenge facing the region. But it's not, as one would have expected, democratic governance only. it's also government effectiveness. And in fact, the government effectiveness challenge, part of this index, is more, has a higher share in almost all of the groups except the medium challenge group than the democratic governance. So that's very telling, because it basically says that governments in this region have a major problem, not just with the pillars of accountability and openness and participation, etc., but also with their ability to function and to deliver on basic services. Now turning into the inequality story, and here is where it gets a bit interesting, because you actually see, first of all, a medium level of inequality using this Development Inequalities Index, which, as I said, captures all kinds of indicators within those three challenges and subnational inequalities. But we also witness improvement. So you have a different trend, I guess, than the DCI. And that could imply that you're actually having more equality in deprivation. And the rank changes, and you can see here in terms of the difference ranks between the Development Challenges Index and the Development Inequalities Index would substantiate that claim, because a lot of the countries that improve in their ranks are the conflict-affected countries, and a lot of the countries that lose are the high-income GCC countries. But this would also imply that we are in what I call a development challenges trap. Because you've got progress happening in multidimensional inequalities, but they're not bringing down your development challenges. You're sort of stuck in this upper right-hand side of the scatter plot, where things are happening. You might be improving on your inequalities, but you're not able to get to that critical threshold where you're going on a nice downward slope, where you have a linear relation between the Development Challenges Index and the DII. So that's the first trap, and I'd like to then move on to the multidimensional poverty story, which, of course, as we started with the basic critical HDI, the equivalent to that would be the global MPI. I think all of you are familiar with it, but it's important to mention here that, this is where poverty is at its measurement is at its best, because you're looking at the overlapping deprivations in these indicators at the household level. You're really getting a zoom in on how families are being affected by these multiple deprivations in nutrition, child mortality, schooling, and living things like cooking fuel, sanitation, drinking water, electricity, and so forth. And so this is of course, a very important indicator. And if you look at the Arab countries for which we have data over time, middle-income countries, we have 7 countries, and we also have 2 LDCs. You'll see that there has been progress made in these indicators of and the multiple deprivations seem to have been declining on average, even though the level is still very high for LDCs. So that, I think, is consistent with the HDI story. There's no surprise here. But of course, the global MPI is designed to capture extreme deprivations. I guess a bit like the HDI was meant to capture the basic capabilities. So what we wanted to do in partnership with OPHI, other UN agencies, and the League of Arab States, but primarily on the intellectual side with OPHI, is to bring a revised Arab multidimensional poverty index that uses the same approach, the Alkir-Foster method, but with tailoring to the situation in Arab countries and the challenges. So this is the revised Arab multidimensional poverty index, because we had a first one which was very similar to the global MPI, except for the thresholds. But in this case, we're adjusting the thinking behind the dimensions. And we have 2 dimensions. One is captures social capabilities and non-material well-being. And the other one is more on the housing, access to services and assets, which and we give equal weight to both of these aspects. And I think you understand perhaps why, when you look at income poverty, why we have this shift in focus, because the indicators related to material well-being in the region are actually more challenging than in other regions. And then we basically set the indicator thresholds depending on what we, it's a long consultative process. Corinne might speak to that, and almost 3 years of consulting with member countries on the umbrella of the League of Arab States. The technical part of this was easy, but getting countries to actually agree to this index was the difficult part. But it was done, and the second Arab poverty, multidimensional poverty report was released early last year, and we get a picture that looks like this. Now, I have to say that these surveys end in most of them before 2019. So what you're seeing here is pre-pandemic. But the story is also consistent with the achievements that we've had in human development. And you can see that there has been, with the exception of 2 countries, improvement in middle-income countries in terms of the decline in multidimensional poverty using the Arab MPI. And so that was one of the key findings of this report. It's not surprising when you actually zoom in on the indicators and you look at what's been happening to gaps within countries. So this scatter plot is coming out of the ERF and ESCWA inequality report that we had in 2019. You can see that most countries are clustered, Arab countries are clustered in the upper left quadrant, which captures higher achievements in these indicators: stunting, education, again, basic indicators, infant mortalities, skilled attendance at birth, etc. And that has also been associated with lower inequalities between rich and poor. So there's progress on the achievement side, there's progress on reducing inequalities between rich and poor. And especially in secondary education, you see this. So the gaps between the rich and poor have been closing, especially in youth secondary completion rates. And that's important because that means you're having an influx of young people with higher expectations now that they have completed a higher level of education. Gender gaps are also narrowing, and in these same indicators, we see that all over in LDCs as well as in middle-income countries. But interestingly, we don't see the same thing happening in the inequality of opportunities in these same indicators. That's what we refer to in the report as the Arab inequality paradox, which is that you have these outcome achievements in inequality that are not matched by achievements or reductions in inequality and opportunities in the same indicators, and especially in secondary education. What that implies is that things like family indicators like family wealth and household head education level are more likely to determine the prospects of inequalities and changes in education today than they were in 2019 and in 2010. So let me now turn to another very important part of the story, which is the conflict-affected countries. Everything I said, there are 2 qualifications. One, it's before 2019, or most of them are before 2019. And second, it doesn't include conflict, and it doesn't include LDCs. So, for example, we have the MAT, which is the Multidimensional Poverty Assist tool we've developed in ESCWA that allows us to undertake simulations to look at the impact of conflict. And we tried it with the based on the information we had with after the war on Gaza. And we had information coming in, indicating the really, horrendous level of increase in deprivations on the ground, whether it's in school enrollments or access to water. I mean, you all see the news. I don't need to say more, but the first 16 days of war led to, us just basically almost more than doubling the poverty rate from 45 as a baseline, and that's the national poverty, multidimensional poverty index of Palestine, and the headcount rate was 45%. So there was 45% of the population in Gaza was poor in 2018, presumably also prior to the war, and that headcount jumped to 96%. And that's just the first 16 days of war. And our brief, which was published a couple of weeks ago, had also mentioned that, even if the war were to stop on day 17, which it hasn't, unfortunately, the aftermath of this is going to stay with the people of Gaza for a very long time. I mean, the MPI would go down, but the implications on multidimensional poverty would endure for years to come. So we're not capturing that in the story that I just said. And many of the LDCs, unfortunately, we don't have surveys for Yemen, Syria, Sudan. We don't know what's going on. But we do know this from a lot of the UN agencies' work on the ground. We know that we have an estimated 70 million people in need of humanitarian assistance and aid, and that has been going up. We know that the trend also in forcibly displaced people, refugees and IDPs has been going up. So we expect that if we were to undertake surveys today and capture MPIs, that they would perhaps also show an increasing trend as in opposition to the trend we witness in middle-income countries. And especially because many of these countries are very vulnerable to climate change, have witnessed also a lot of natural disasters. And we can see here that the population affected by these natural disasters, and especially droughts, has been on the rise in the region. So that's the story with the MPI. And now let me turn to income poverty, the other part of the story. And I mean, in ESCWA, we of course advocate for multidimensional poverty as being our usual entry point for social development policies and our advice. But it's important to also bring into the picture income poverty and look at the dynamics between income and multidimensional poverty, or indicators in income space are also important, especially in this region. And you'll see why when you look at this figure, which is a poverty map or a poverty sweep of poverty rates for all poverty lines from $1 up to $15 a day in 2017 PPPs. And the story is clear. The region today is poorer in 2023 than it was in 2010, regardless of the choice of poverty line. In fact, it's poorer than in 1995 for all poverty lines below $5 a day, which the majority of countries would use that as the appropriate benchmark for measuring national poverty lines. And that basically translates into 76.4 million people living in extreme poverty today. That's 55 million people more than we had in 1995. And it's the only region where we've seen an increase in poverty since 2010, is the Arab region. And it also translates, if we use the ESCWA poverty lines, and I was just speaking to Professor James about what the ESCWA poverty before we started the lecture. And essentially what the ESCWA poverty lines do is that they anchor poverty lines to national, the way that countries measure and define their own national poverty lines. So if you have an increase in income, your poverty line would increase, but not at the same rate as the rise in income. And according to that benchmark, we have 146 million people living in poverty and almost 70 million more poor than we had in 1995. What does that mean? One of the things it means is that you have a poorer middle class. So if you take the middle class as just the social definition, look at the people in the middle of the occupational ladder, look at a country like Egypt. In 2018, I think this data is coming from, almost 57% are poor or vulnerable to poverty using the national definition. So this is the upper poverty line, and the population below the nationally defined upper poverty line. Now, why are we seeing this? Is it an inequality problem? So when you look at these surveys and you look at the changes in the Gini, it doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, we're looking at this is the average, the weighted average of the Ginis from the household income surveys, and you can see that the trend is one of decline in all of the groups, all of the three groups. So it doesn't seem to be an inequality problem if you look at the surveys. The challenge, as what we've been saying in many of our publications, is that growth, which is already very low at the national level, GDP growth being less than the world average, gets a lot lower when you convert it into per capita terms. And that's from the national accounts. But when you look at the growth in household incomes, it's actually negative. And that's why you see this rise in poverty. Basically, the growth, whatever is happening at the national level in national accounts in private consumption expenditure or GDP growth, is not reflecting down at the household level. And that translates into a very low pass-through. And one of the implications of having this low pass-through is that you need a very high rate of GDP growth to get the same impact that you're seeing in other regions like South Asia or Latin America. That's basically for every 1% growth rate that you see at the national accounts, only 1/3 translates down at the household level, way below the median worldwide. And that leads us to our second trap, the poverty growth trap, that growth is happening, but the poor are not benefiting from this, and you don't get this relationship between income growth and poverty reduction. And so that's what I call the second poverty growth trap. But it also may suggest that our understanding of income inequality may not, from the surveys, may not be accurate, because as we know, the surveys don't really capture the top, the highest earners. So when you adjust for these top incomes, as Piketty does, the inequality story might be significantly higher. But also when you look at wealth inequality data and you come up with a statistic like the richest 21 people in the region have wealth that is higher than the GDP of the Syria, Yemen, and Somalia combined, it also indicates that we might have a much bigger inequality issue than what we see from the household surveys. But of course, if we take the region as one unit, okay, so if we have just collapse all of the income distributions of the region, treat them as one country, then the Arab region does become glaringly so the highest inequality region worldwide. And if we break down this Gini, the regional Gini, we'll find that the between country inequalities are significant, and 84% of the share of that Gini would come from between country inequalities, which makes sense because conflict affected countries have been seeing their income go down, and the GCC has been continuing on to rise. So that's the only region worldwide where we see this, because all the other regions we have an improvement in their Ginis, and the world Gini, as you can see here, is declining. So I guess that's where I stop with the stylized facts, and I want to move to the. I think we're doing okay on time. Just move to the policy implications of all of this. So let's summarize what are the main findings that we can come up with just looking at all of these stylized facts. Well, for one thing, I think it would be fair to say that we had a social contract that delivered on basic human capabilities, but it reached its limit, arguably by some time, like in the early 2000s. But by 2010, it was clear that you had major challenges in income poverty and across a lot of these broader human development outcomes, especially quality education, and especially in equality in opportunities. But post 2010, we see what I call divergent pathways, especially between the GCC and the conflict-affected countries. So you really have very different stories of human development and poverty coming out post 2010. So that's the summary of what we've seen so far. And now the question is what to do and where do we want to go with the region and from this human development, human capability, Sen-like approach of human development. Well, obviously you want to change the whole system. You want to have a different, what I call a virtuous development, human development cycle. You want to see these enhanced human capabilities, and especially in quality education, be translated in things like material well-being, especially through decent, productive employment. You want to see lower informality. You want to see more social protection. You want to see structural transformation. You want to see an expanding middle class. You want to see higher taxes feeding back into human development and human capabilities. And that's the cycle that we're all seeking. But to get there, obviously, we need to start somewhere. And to argue, I mean, at least that's the position that we have as a result of all of the research we've done, and especially in the World Development Challenges, that the starting point in this region is the governance deficit, because any which way you look at it, the Arab region has a significant deficit. And also conceptually, we believe that institutions lead human development. Of course, it's a bidirectional causality, but in the Arab region, I think the return on investing in governance is going to be significant. So, and you can just look here at the scatter plot and look at the location of Arab countries lying below the regression line, significantly below the regression line between human development, quality adjusted human development, and our governance index. But, excuse me, but it also might mean that we need to rethink our economic policies. Because missing from the story so far is the fact that Arab countries have actually witnessed, a lot of them, especially middle-income countries and many of the LDCs, and before 2010, but even afterwards, a lot of economic reforms, liberal economic reforms, negotiation with the IMF and the standard Washington consensus-like policies. Let's just recap what these policies were intended to deliver on. Well, to start off, obviously, when a country gets into economic trouble, the stabilization is a very important price stability, and bringing in, correcting the prices becomes the important and first step to do. And then you move into privatization, liberalization, structural adjustments that are supposed to bring back the promising sectors with a high growth rates and boost your productivity and competitiveness. And that, of course, leads to, in the traditional, causal chain of things, to rise in exports, productivity, employment, consumption, savings. And of course, the end result is you have lower poverty and significantly improved human development. So that was the thinking behind a lot of the economic reform programs. And that was the promise of reform that was supposed to deliver. What happened was different, though. What happened was that we've witnessed rising informality and deindustrialization, vulnerable employment. What happened was we've seen productivity rates go down, whether in oil-rich or oil-poor countries, and even the labor productivity rates being closely tied to crude oil prices. What happened was that we've seen persistently low tax revenues. The region's tax revenues being significantly below what you would expect for their income levels. And what happened is that we've seen large and increasing trade and fiscal deficits, even for high-income oil exporting countries prior to 2021. What's happened is that we see debt rising faster than GDP for nearly 2 decades. 2 decades. So that obviously translates into less fiscal space for social expenditure, and the region has less than half of the world average in terms of social expenditures. And of course, that affects your ability to provide quality education or health service. So what went wrong? Was it the fact that, as many would argue, perhaps from the World Bank and others, that there wasn't enough liberalization? Maybe the region, in implementing its reform, should have gone further with reducing the size of the public sector, public wages or subsidies. Others would argue it was basically the democratic governance deficits. And of course, Adeel can speak more to the rent-seeking clientelism arguments. But there are macroeconomists that would tell you, no way, you couldn't have done this with the kind of Dutch disease, overvalued exchange rates and low absorptive capacities. Or perhaps also people on the labor market side saying that you had a huge mismatch between education and the demand of the labor market. Whatever it was, of course, we have to distinguish again between, in the diversity of between Arab countries, that there's no one story fits all here. But where I would argue that the standard narrative got it wrong was, and I would argue that it got it wrong in several of these stories, but especially when it came to public sector reform, and especially when it came to public sector employment, the fixation on reducing the size of the public sector, for example, I think was misguided. And it was misguided because the basic statistic that was applied was the size of the public employment relative to the labor force. Now, as you can see on the left side, a scatter plot, a lot of the Arab countries are in fact outliers. They have very high public employment shares if you use the labor force as your benchmark. But why would you do that? Especially when Arab countries have very small labor force shares for various reasons, including low female participation rates. Isn't the public sector supposed
to... Apologies, Khalid. If you could just wind up in 2 minutes, if it's okay.
I need another 5 minutes, if that's fine.
Okay.
So if you were to use the total population and then rethink the size and adjust for quality of, or the efficiency of public employment, you'll see, in fact, that a lot more needs to be done on improving the quality of public sector delivery rather than on reducing the size. So this is just one example where I think one can get back to these economic reforms and start questioning their logic. But there are two narratives I would argue in terms of where we go from here. One is to continue on with improved market-led reforms. And the other one, which I think would make more sense, is to bring in more state-led structural transformation processes. And my argument basically is very simple, is that regardless of, whether or not you're talking about democratic governance or government effectiveness, these governance reforms don't happen in a vacuum. You need to have this new political economy of reform setting, and that setting will be informed by these directions that you take, whether it's a more liberal direction of relying on markets or relying on states. And again, the countries in the region are so diverse that I don't think that one model would, again, fit all countries. But whatever you do, the sequencing matters. And perhaps the best thing that we've learned, and especially in the case of Lebanon, where I'm stationed, is that you need to start with institutional reforms. So more important than the direction that a country takes, and it is important, is the institutional gap and filling that. And of course, we have to remember that the opportunity cost of inaction is very high. I mean, when we punch in the numbers of the expected growth rates and you look at the forecasted income growth trends, using these pass-throughs and given the settings that we already have, the business as usual scenario is still a rise in income poverty, regardless of even with some of the growth rates being higher than what we witnessed during the COVID period. Then this is my last slide, and I'm going to stop here. A lot of the development challenges that I've alluded to, conflict and political instability, environmental challenges, all of them have a very strong regional dimension. And I haven't talked a lot about the regional part of the story or about the opportunities that that present themselves with stronger regional collaboration. But in fact, they are enormous. And so that's one thought that perhaps I'd like to end with, that if the region turns towards its own homegrown solutions and a lot more collaboration within the region, perhaps we can see a lot more progress on human development and poverty challenges. So I'll stop here and turn it back to you, Adeel. And sorry if I took a little bit more time than expected.
No, thank you. This was a very exhaustive presentation, very enlightening. Maybe, Corinne, you could start the discussion and then we'll see how we go.
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Khalid. Very interesting presentation. I certainly learned a lot. I'm just going to speak mostly to the part on the Arab multidimensional poverty analysis, because that's the part that I feel qualified to speak about. And perhaps Adeel or James will be able to speak about other elements of the presentation. I wanted to highlight a few things. One is just to put this work into context globally. This is the first real published country-owned work of this scale of a regionally comparable multidimensional poverty index. And so I think that just highlighting that is important. It's a project that other regional bodies are now beginning to learn from and think about, and certainly looking to ESCWA's and the League of Arab States and others' experience in this regard. I think one of the other strengths of the project that Khalid touched on, but I wanted to emphasize, is that it engaged policymakers as well as statisticians and other stakeholders such as UN agencies, especially through its partnership with the League of Arab States in terms of engaging the countries themselves. And I think that, as Khalid hinted, is not easy, but is really important for building consensus and for ensuring that the numbers and all of the work that the technical team puts into it is used for informing evidence-based policy. So I think I just wanted to highlight that as an example of how these types of reports can be more than just reports on the bookshelf, but actually be part of informing policy, especially alongside the Arab Strategic Framework on multidimensional poverty. And then I also wanted to comment briefly on two challenges of this work. One is a little bit more conceptual, which is how in such a diverse context, such a diverse region, how do we accurately and usefully create comparable measures across the region? I think this was something that was a challenge that we struggled with, thinking about what conceptually would be important and what is available in the data. And so I think there's certainly lessons to be learned from that in thinking about future work. Obviously, this second Arab MPI report was already a revision of the earlier work on the subject. And then lastly, but not least, is the challenge in terms of data availability, especially for some of the LDCs and fragile states, but also for some of the GCC states. And I think that there's little that we, or in our positions, can maybe do, but just to emphasize that the lack of more recent data in many of these cases does limit a little bit how relevant the picture is in terms of thinking about the current situation, and also thinking about some of the countries that weren't included and what they might look like if they were included in the analysis. So I think that there has been post-COVID so there are some surveys currently being collected that are in the field that could hopefully be included in future rounds. But just another call for further data from anyone who has the authority to make that happen.
All right, great. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this presentation. I think I've been teaching a module on poverty and human development to my students there who focus on the MENA region. And I've heavily relied on many of the reports that ESCWA has done. And I think the great thing about these reports is that they are agenda-setting reports because they kind of summarize, provide a larger context, both temporal context and regional context, and sets out these large issues, which I think really each one of these issues requires more work in the future. So I've got a couple of comments that really crisscross the governance dimension. Now, Khalid, you know, it's a big challenge in the region is to think about how do we measure governance. It's a global challenge, but particularly in the MENA region. Because typically we have to rely on governance indicators, on government effectiveness, democracy. A lot of the countries do not fare well in those. So I think the real challenge is to unpack the governance deficit, both conceptually as well as empirically. So let me try and throw in a few ideas on that. I think your series of reports have clearly shown that the Arab world has made impressive gains in human development over the first several decades after independence. And it is clear that this gain is primarily rooted in the particular political economy model that the region has followed, in the particular generous social contract that many of the Arab regimes, whether resource rich or resource poor, have pursued. Social welfare was a key priority because that's how you create a social contract. You provide them education, employment, health, education, and create legitimacy for rule. So I think that is very clear. But what we are now seeing is the reversal of human development many dimensions or gains, contraction, rise in inequality. There's a big story about inequality that needs to be probed. And linked with this are these data gaps, which actually are a manifestation of the governance challenge, because if you want to measure inequality well, you need to have a good household survey, right? And a lot of these household surveys are either not conducted or are very sparse. And we don't know a lot about spatial inequalities, which I imagine will be huge, right? In North Africa, there is a clear coastal interior divide, the whole range of other axes along which some of these outcomes could vary, and we don't know a whole lot. There are a few reports, both by ESCWA and the World Bank, but those spatial inequalities and the availability of fine-grained data is a challenge. But here, I think a lot of these latest computing methods, the advances in geographic information system, some of these, I wonder if Arab barometric survey is sufficiently fine-grained, but I think that those data gaps could be filled if we make use of these new computational advances. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is the sort of vulnerability that has been highlighted by you. That yes, we had this initial phase, there were a lot of human development successes, but we're now entering into a stage where a lot of this progress is more vulnerable to conflict, to climate, to governance challenges, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, it kind of links with the core question of structural transformation. And it appeared to me that perhaps a lot of the reports you've done are now leading to diminishing marginal returns. You've documented a lot of good stuff, but how do we really make a substantive change on the human development front actually would be determined in whether or not these economies are able to transform themselves economically, right? And that economic transformation particularly depends on a strong manufacturing base, and particularly employment generating manufacturing. The figure that stood out for me in your slides was this very low translation from growth to poverty reduction, right? And that is partly because a lot of the growth that has taken place in the region has been capital intensive growth, which again is linked with governance because of subsidies, because of the dominance of crony firms in these big sectors, their reliance on particular kinds of subsidies. And obviously there's been a lot of work, micro level work on the region, including by Saad Diwan, that talks about the capital intensity of that growth process. Now, let me end on a final observation, which I think is important, conceptually. It seems to me that even the first period of success needs to be reevaluated. Because in a way, those were successes. Infant mortality declined, health coverage increased, education increased, but it was both an avenue for many of these regimes to build up legitimacy, but also to create employment. A lot of these countries spent huge amounts on education, in part also because they were key avenues for creating employment, which was good. But what it did effectively is to create a trade-off, a contradiction in development between access and empowerment. You know, you have more access to education and health, but then you do not have agency. You do not have sufficient empowerment in the sense that a lot of these middle classes that are produced are, as you argue, more vulnerable, but also they feel trapped in low productive jobs, right? And they also feel trapped in terms of their aspirations. Because when we're thinking about these middle classes, it is not just how they fared on income, but in terms of their aspirations and expectations. So they compare themselves with their parents, which is temporal expectation, and with other people around, right? Where there's a lot of this relative deprivation that could come in. So they have limited mobility as well. So a lot of the successes that we described in the first phase actually also set the stage for a model of human development that contained in itself an inherent contradiction, where you have access that actually leads to more less empowerment, less agency, more feeling of being trapped. But I think it's precisely for all these reasons that this is a hugely interesting region to study human development, and where I think for both OPHI and the Department of International Development could be very useful. We need more qualitative research dissertations that could build on these broad macro facts and really do detailed field work, thinking about why there's inequality of opportunity, what type of spatial inequalities exist, and many different types of governance challenges. I mean, one key governance challenge in Morocco, for example, there are 140 different programs historically on different human development outcomes, and 56 different agencies dealing with those human development programs. So you get huge bureaucratic fragmentation and stasis, very difficult to make decisions. But I think what you've done is really important work, and it opens a whole new frontier, which requires separate streams of work to take this work forward, both in terms of filling the empirical gaps, but also building on this empirical material and creating new conceptual ways to understand where the region is headed. But one thing is for sure, you know, 14 years ago when I started teaching this course, I used to teach a paper from an economic development and cultural change by a World Bank chief economist who argued, well, the MENA is low inequality region, high levels of human development. I still keep that paper on my reading list to tell students how far we have come, right? So that consensus in a way is really broken. And thanks to the excellent work that you and your institution have done on it, but obviously it creates a whole new frontier for us to explore. So perhaps on that note, I can pass it on to others on the panel, and also indeed any comments that you might have from there. Maybe James, you could take it from there.
Well, I'll be happy to, and I'll say for anyone who's participating, please put any questions in the Q&A part of the platform, that would be great. Otherwise, I just want to make a quick comment here. I really appreciated the broad sweep of your discussion. It really piqued my interest. I like the first order dominance stuff, of course, since that's something that's near and dear to my way of looking at poverty through time, and the fact you can unambiguously compare things is really important. But also the discussion of not getting the job done, the state not illustrating the capacity to get the job done. I think that is really an interesting aspect of governance. That's the core of governance, of course. Is it in fact the public services being delivered and so on and so forth. So I really would like for you to dig into that just a little more and tell me what's happening there. Also, I'll just mention one other thing. I've always thought that there should be regional cooperation in the sense ECLAC is over there doing interesting stuff in Latin America, and some of the issues are very similar. And Santiago Levy just gave a talk recently in which he once again made the statement that, similar to what was just made, that bureaucracy, you have so many different groups that are conducting so many different programs and policy, and in fact, they intersect very poorly, so that one policy actually goes against another policy within the same government. I think that has led to his consternation, particularly in Mexico, in the inability to move forward after his very successful Progresa Oportunidades program, but not leading to large gains in employment. So I just thought I'd turn those comments back over to you, Khalid, if you wanted to comment on everyone's comment.
Yes, thank you. Should I come in now? And
I think it would be most appropriate to respond.
We can also get more questions, and there's a question by an anonymous attendee. How do you perceive the role of human activities versus climate change in contributing to water scarcity? And what policy recommendations would be proposed to address the complex issue? In this topic for another seminar, but at least you can address this.
Sorry, what was the first question? The role of
human activities versus climate change in contributing to water scarcity. So water scarcity is climate change driven, others is human intervention.
Yeah, I mean, let me touch on this first, because the region obviously is the most scarce in terms of fresh water availability, and you compare our replenishment rates to the usage rates. Obviously, this we are in a very difficult position, and that's one of the major vulnerabilities. But we didn't actually include this in the World Development Challenges Index because of this being unique to the region. We didn't want to bias the design of the index. But if you're in Saudi Arabia or in the Gulf, does it really matter how much water that I have underground if I can, have a desalination plants or plants and just have access to fresh water, usable water? So there's been a debate about this, and obviously I think it matters. I mean, that's my own position. But from an access point of view, a lot of countries don't have an issue. They might have an issue if, for whatever reasons, these plants don't work. But barring that, it's for oil-rich countries, you don't have a problem. Where you have a problem is in countries like Somalia, Sudan, Yemen. This is where it becomes very problematic, and this is where it becomes obviously human activities, growing cots, for example, in Yemen, has a major implication on water scarcity. So I fully agree. I fully subscribe to this point of view. And we should be doing more. The transfer or shift from regular irrigation to sprinkle irrigation and other forms of it to save water in Egypt is vital for our water security in the future. So this is a hugely important issue that I fully agree. Climate change is coming, and we're going to be affected by it. We already are, and a lot of the regions that are sub-regions that are affected are also the most vulnerable. And so the poor in these countries are unfortunately going to pay the price for this. So this again calls back to the question of, something needs to change. The business model or the Arab development model is not delivering, as you said, Adeel. We all know that. The question is why. We all agree on governance, but then as you mentioned, governance is this hugely complex thing that needs to be unpacked, defined. And unfortunately, we're not able to do that with a lot of accuracy because of the data limitations. And conceptually also, it's hard to get two experts to agree on what does good governance mean. That's why we spent a lot of time on this. And we had a split, I guess, between those who thought of good governance more as a process of implementing values, things like accountability and rule of law and participation, because the argument was if you had that, you wouldn't have a problem with human rights. You wouldn't have a problem with corruption. You wouldn't have a problem with many of the outcomes that we see, which I think is important, obviously. But then there was the other view that thought, what really matters is for now, for Arab countries to deliver and the governments to be efficient. Democratic values are important, but that's not really the priority is for things to get done and to get done efficiently. We took a position that is basically midpoint. I mean, we basically subscribe to the view of both of these things are important, equally important, and they have to move in tandem. They have to move at the same time. Now, how do you measure governance? We relied on the varieties of democracy because they're very open and transparent about the way that their database is very clear on how they measure governance. But for government effectiveness, we relied on the World Bank, the index of the Kaufman and Company Index. It's not perfect, but it does provide a basis for this narrative. And we acknowledge that this needs to improve, and we acknowledge that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, both at the conceptual level and at the empirical one. And that's something that we would like to work on, of course. So just quickly, 2 comments. Inequality is such a hugely complex issue. And depending on what kind of inequality you're talking about, I mean, I can come up with, or we can see 3 or 4 different stories just talking about one indicator, which is income inequality. There's the Piketty story, there's a survey story, there's stories that, when you adjust for expenditure or income, and it's just, it's very difficult to tell one story, one unifying story. But what we try to do in the ERF ESCWA report is to bring all of these stories together and then try to make sense of all of this. And the most important one is that this paradox you see between rising outcome, progress in outcome inequalities, so gaps between rich and poor, spatial gaps are closing, and between the opportunities. But as you rightly pointed out, these are basic indicators: access to water, sanitation, infant mortality. We're not talking quality of education here. If I bring in the quality factor, you're going to see inequalities shooting and going up. Unfortunately, we're not able to do that in a worldwide scale. But this is a very important caveat, that the inequality story has many angles, and it's very simplistic to say that it's one story. But where I think the innovation that we have is that it seems that basic inequalities have improved, or gaps between rich and poor, gaps in some of the basic services and some of the basic development achievements. But that hasn't been translated into material well-being for the very same reasons that you mentioned, because there's no structural transformation. And why is that? Because of the political economy of rent, Dutch disease, lack of structural transformation. And that's why most of our effort going forward the next 2 years is going to be on Arab transformational processes and looking deeper into why we have this deindustrialization and how do we reverse that. Perhaps even going into more advanced CGE modeling techniques to be able to answer questions like what would happen if you were to have more integration and more infrastructure networks between Arab economies, better enhancements in efficiency? How would they translate into decent work? What would happen to the middle class? What would happen to income poverty? So that's what we're thinking of going in terms of our next big flagship publication. So one last thing on the proliferation of policies. We have an interesting tool for that will take us a long way to be able to address some of these duplications, and it's the social expenditure monitor. Basically, that's a tool that we have, and it's led by my colleague Niranjan, who leads the work that we do on fiscal policies. And what that does is to try to look at the functional classification of expenditures at the subnational level. So you can zoom in on the kind of expenditures that are happening in a sector at a subnational level and look at the beneficiaries and who's actually contributing to these expenditures. And when you have that map of social expenditures and you compare it with the MPI at the district level, hopefully if you can match both levels, then you have a complete revolution in the way that you can design socio-economic policies, because you're looking at outcomes at a very microscopic level, and you're also looking at the inputs. We're not there yet, but that's where we're hoping to get in a few years. So thanks for these very interesting questions, and thank you so much, Adeel and colleagues, for these very encouraging remarks. And I appreciate it. Over to you, Adeel.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let's get a few reactions from the floor, if there are any questions here, comments. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid, for this excellent presentation. I have a question regarding the challenge of governance effectiveness. I mean, it's quite a paradoxical thing to me, because there are countries outside the Arab world which are not democracies. China, for example, being not a democracy, is still a very effective country in terms of governance. But when you come to the Arab world, you see, I think, barring Lebanon, all of them are not democracies, they're all autocracies. And within the Arab world, there are certain countries which are delivering good on governance and have effective governance systems, despite being rentier states, and while some are not. So how much of this lack of governance or this can be attributed to rentierism, and how much it can be attributed to the lack of democracy? So what are your views on that?
You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting question. Generally, you'll see that in the GCC oil-rich economies, or particularly in the GCC, the government effectiveness component is lower in terms of the challenge, and the democratic governance challenge would be higher. But if you go to the LDCs and conflict-affected countries, it's the other way around. In a country like Lebanon, as you correctly pointed out, the government effectiveness challenge will be huge. There is some space for voice, but I would say even for accountability and all of the other aspects of democratic governance, even Lebanon has huge gaps. A rule of law, for example, would be a huge problem in Lebanon. And then other countries would have, depending on each country's situation, would have its own mix. But overall, I was surprised to see that the share of government effectiveness was so high. I would have expected, just pre-analytically, that the democratic governance would be more of a challenge than what we've seen. And I guess maybe because also this is a vicious cycle, because once you enter into the dynamics of conflict and you have spillover effects that also lead to governments being unable to deliver on their basic functions or deliver the requisite quality. So we have entered into this vicious cycle, especially in conflict-affected countries. So to answer your question, is both are important, but clearly, there's a big difference between the oil-rich GCCs and between the LDCs. So definitely that point is well taken.
And of course, there should be also a role for decentralization, the debate on the extent to which because in China, you have a single party rule, but you have quite a lot of decentralization in terms of public goods provision.
Indeed. And I think it's through decentralization that you will be able to get a lot of the efficiency gains in the government effectiveness. And because that's where we're at. There's now, I think in many countries that we've gotten to a point where you have to move to less centrally planned or ways of development planning and implementing development plans. Otherwise you won't be able to continue with even the most basic forms of development progress. But of course, that is a political challenge, not just a technical one. And each country. Excuse me.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
No, I was just saying that, a very different situation in Libya, for example, or conflict-affected countries in particular to Morocco or Egypt. In Sudan, for example, you had some level of decentralization. I mean, but it didn't work as one would have expected for various other reasons. So each country has this is where it gets interesting, because this is where the region-wide narrative doesn't work. And especially when you're talking about decentralization, you have to zoom in at a country level. There's no one policy that would fit all countries here. For some countries, it would be very difficult to implement. But for others, I can see probably no other way to go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good point to bring the discussion to a close, but I was thinking when we think about Lebanon, private provision is a key part of the story. There's a lot of work by Melanie Clement and Nisreen Salti and many other people talked about sort of private provision, charitable provision. And in countries like Iraq, for example, where the state itself is divided, when we talk about government effectiveness, one of the roots of lack of effectiveness is that the state is divided and is up for capture. So if you look at the health department in Iraq, different sectarian groups have control over the health department. And same goes for education. In Libya, you have similar processes underway where different line ministries are basically different budget items that are up for grabs. And the governance challenge there becomes even more basic, which is you don't have a centralized state. And so what does government effectiveness mean in that context? So there's a really interesting agenda when we unpack the governance deficit, which can help to explain the scale of the human development challenge. I mean, the scale of the challenge in Iraq today is very different from pre-occupation Iraq, for example. The scale of the challenge in Libya today is very different from the pre-intervention Libya. And I guess the same could be said for Syria too. So this is a region which is actually going through a massive human development crisis, right? A lot of these statistics hide the true scale of the challenge. But I think your reports are really helpful in helping us understand how this is evolving. Especially, I would encourage participants to look at one of your other reports that talked about the impact of the conflict on some of these areas. So, unless there are any comments or questions, please.
I just was curious, and you could be brief if you'd like, but how much of this is caused by Western countries in their, as you mentioned, well, sort of destabilization of the region? And then I have kind of a second question. Would it be more helpful to make sort of like subgroups, and do you have that information? As you mentioned, sort of country by country, but maybe subgroups like North African countries or specifically Middle Eastern Arab countries, something like that.
I mean, it's an interesting question. How much of this is due to policy failures that are attributed to our own within country, within region shortfalls in thinking or in policy implementation versus the global reform agenda, which has been affecting not just Arab countries, but most developing countries I don't know. I mean, I think that the reform agenda may have produced some negative, obviously negative impacts on the structure of Arab economies. They may have exacerbated the rentier political economy manifestations. But I don't think they were the root cause of this. I'm not going to subscribe to that point of view. I think it was failures in the ability to make the shift from the developmental state of the 60s, the idea of a developmental state, and then going from that to something like a pseudo market, but not really. It wasn't really, it wasn't, the idea was to perhaps emulate the Asian experience and structure transformation. At least that's what the rhetoric or the stated logic, but the capacities of the state were not equipped to make that transformation, and certainly not the dynamics of the oil-led growth and all of the other political economy narratives that come along with that. And Adeel, of course, is more of an expert. So it's a hard question, but I don't think the reforms by themselves are the main culprit. I think it's the region not having its own homegrown development model. And that, I think, brings me back to perhaps my closing statement is, I mean, if there's a reason for optimism for the future, is that the opportunities are huge. If you decide to go for this homegrown development narrative, look at the reconstruction needs or construction needs of the region. I think, especially with national development plans and opportunities having reached their limits, I think that if you bring in the regional aspect to this, and look at the opportunities across Arab countries, I think that particular aspect hasn't been explored sufficiently. Before, the idea of pan-Arabism has been explored or exploited, I should say, for political reasons. Now I think it's the economic logic that should dictate this, because a lot of the national policies have reached a limit, and many of these problems will simply not be solved unless you get better regional collaboration. So that would be my 2 cents on this.
Great. So, Costa, if it's okay with you, we can close the session on this optimistic note.
I think that makes entire sense, and I'll go ahead and close it formally then, thanking everyone who needs to be thanked. That's it for today in the joint series on multidimensional poverty and indeed well-being and regional discussions as well. Thanks to our speakers, Khalid, Adeel, and Corinne. Colleagues in person at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, thank you for being there. And all of you online here at IIEP in Washington, DC, and especially Maddie who run the show for us online. Thank you, everyone. We hope to see you again soon.